Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining in, both to those who are joining us remotely, virtually, and to those who are present live. It's exciting world and exciting times that we're in. Really appreciate the time that you're making to join us today. As Jeanette mentioned, I'm Abhishek Gupta. I'll be moderating the panel today. I am the founder and principal researcher at the Montreal AI Ethics Institute. It's an international nonprofit research institute with a mission to democratize AI ethics literacy. I also work as a machine learning engineer at Microsoft and serve as the chair for the standards working group at the Queen Software Foundation. Um, we've got an exciting lineup today. We always hear a lot about the dystopic, trends, the dystopic futures that AI, might bring about. But what can some alternatives look like? Especially as we talk about, facial recognition systems and the concentration of power, the homogenization in the field. What are some alternatives? What can they look like? And what might AI enable in the future that makes it look a little different from all the dystopic imaginations that we have about it today? Maybe there are creative applications from a community perspective that can help utilize AI to build a better future. So with that in mind, we've got with us a stellar set of people today. We're joined by Priya, joined by Kathleen, we're joined by Jason, and to give you a little bit more, you'll see that Jeanette, I think, will be dropping in some descriptions about all of them in the chat window. But I'll turn it over first to Priya to introduce herself, and then Kathleen, followed by Jason. Priya, over to you.
Hey, Abhishek, thanks, and thanks to the organizers of today's event. So I'm Priya Donti. I'm a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University in the US, working on machine learning for electric power systems. I'm also one of the co-founders and chairs of Climate Change AI, which is a global initiative that aims to catalyze impactful work at the intersection of climate change and machine learning by providing education, infrastructure, building a community, and advancing public discourse in this area. So super excited to participate today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kathleen Siminyu. I'm a machine learning fellow over at Mozilla, working on a project known as Common Voice. So I'm particularly working on building speech recognition for Kiswahili. I've previously worked in NLP, building for African languages for quite some time. I'm part of Masakane, which is a network of researchers working to particularly build African language resources. I'm also coming from a background of building a lot of AI, ML, data science communities. So I'm part of the Deep Learning Indaba committee, and that's been very instrumental in, I'll say, building local communities at national levels in, various countries in Africa. And I also co-organized the Nairobi Women in Machine Learning and Data Science community for 3 years, a couple of years back. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you very much for having me.
Hello, everybody. It's nice to see you all. And thank you, Abhishek, for the invitation and the organizers for the invitation to be part of this conversation. I'm looking forward to it. My name is Jason Lewis. I teach at the Design and Computational Arts Department at Concordia University in Montreal. And I am the co-founder of Aboriginal Territories in Cyberspace, which is a research network that I run with my long-term collaborator and my wife, Skawanati, and that's been looking at the intersection between Indigenous culture and digital and computational and network technologies since about 2004. And sort of most recently, I helped co-organize the Indigenous Protocol and Artificial Intelligence workshops, along with OEV Parker Jones and Angie Abdillah, who will be speaking on a panel tomorrow, I believe, along with some of our other participants in those workshops, and the editor for the position paper that came out of that. So generally interested in, or generally focused these days on what might Indigenous perspectives towards both sort of like kind of thinking about, but also designing and deploying artificial intelligence be?
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Well, first to all of you for making the time. I know each of you is tremendously busy doing lots of amazing work in each of your communities. So it's great to have you share your time with us today. So I'd like to kick things off. Well, first, before I even get into some of the questions that I have, for all those who are listening in, I'd love if you have questions to drop in your questions into the chat window, and I'll pick them up and bring them up to our panelists today. So please feel free to keep dropping in questions as you're listening in and watching today. So let's get things started. I will pose this question to Kathleen first. And then would love to hear from Priya and Jason after. What are some of the biggest barriers you see to the current discourse in imagining what the future of AI, what the future looks like with AI playing a role in it, or perhaps AI maybe not playing a role in it, if you want to be provocative as well.
Okay, I really enjoyed thinking about this question, and I think I'd like for us to decenter the role of big tech entirely, just because they have the data, the skills, and the resources to build AI right now is not a good enough reason to let them continue to do so. And I'd like to see more intentional, localized, community-driven AI solutions that work towards putting the power in the hands of data owners. So whether the data owners be patients seeking medical treatment for a certain ailment, or they be members of a community that speaks a certain dialect of a language, I'd like to see a future where these groups, as data owners, have autonomy over the use of their data versus, the current status quo where whoever aggregates data is able to disenfranchise everyone who the data is about.
Awesome. So maybe jumping in, I 100% agree with everything Kathleen just said. And I guess one thing I'll add to it is I would like to see the AI community, or those who already sort of have access to these skills and toolkits, et cetera, take more agency broadly in making those futures happen. I think sometimes a lot of discourse in the AI community around what ethical AI looks like, what equitable AI looks like, are, I think, largely disconnected from the actual practice of how then many practitioners actually go about this. So many people will, of course, talk about this, but then continue to work with, big tech companies or only those companies that already have a lot of data and power, rather than trying to think creatively about how to empower a broader set of stakeholders and also build capacity among those stakeholders so that they themselves can be agents in contributing to the development of AI. So I would really like to see sort of a lot of the discourse translate into practice, and for those who are already leading that charge to be sort of recognized also for those efforts.
So I love those answers. I think what I would add, I like the question too. I was thinking a lot about this question about imagining what the future looks like. And I think there's a couple things that make it difficult to imagine real alternatives. So part of it is kind of misdirection, in the sense that a lot of what we are all talking about with AI these days is really basically statistics with big data, right? It's not sort of AI in the sense of what we might actually think about human beings being intelligent in the world. And so we've kind of ended up with this imaginary about AI, which is really skewed towards a particular way that it's been implemented and its particular consequences because of that implementation. I think echoing part of what Priya and Kathleen said, participation is really important in terms of who gets to participate in not just making, that's hard enough, but who gets to participate in imagining what these futures might be like. And I think this particularly necessary right now, because my opinion is that sort of the Western future imaginary is exhausted. It's just sort of kind of spiraling down into this dystopic morass of, I think, subconscious recognition of how screwed the current system is and how poorly it's dealing with the challenges that are facing us and how badly it's treating very large segments of our population. And so that is coming out in the way that we're imagining things. Plus, a lot of these imaginaries were really first kind of laid down in the beginning of the last century with the sort of effervescence of Western science fiction. And we've sort of played out those tropes and played out the counter tropes and played out the critiques. And we just kind of stay in the same ruts. So I think part of it is going to communities outside of that Western imaginary that are approaching the whole question of who we are as human beings from very different perspectives, and providing the space and the resources to allow those communities to play out and really think hard about what they want their futures to be, and particularly, what they think about when they think about intelligence and what kind of machines we might want to build that contribute to that.
And if I can also jump in to add to something there, Jason, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you say Western also, it's presumably not just in some sense on a country basis, that there's sort of a, predominant narrative that goes on, of course, within certain countries. And that, for example, I mean, this is why I know, right? Indigenous voices, for example, are often not mainstreamed in that. Very like local communities or marginalized communities, et cetera, are not often mainstreamed in that. So I think it's also about sort of recognizing that we both need to extend outreach in terms of, capacity, in terms of the countries, for example, that are represented, but that also even thinking locally, we can actually do a lot to sort of extend this imagination beyond the communities that already participate.
Yeah, hugely. I mean, when you get me really wound up, I'll talk about the legacy of post-Enlightenment rationalist scientific, approaches to blah, blah, blah. But yeah, absolutely. It's a mindset. It's an ideology. It's not a localized, it's not a geographic critique.
Definitely. I think those are all fantastic points. And in fact, it makes me think about, what the dominant thought processes and discourse is when it comes to, imaginations, even about what's transpired in history and what might happen in the future. I'm reading this book called The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and Wengrow. And it is, I can see Jason getting excited about that. So I think he gives it a thumbs up. Yeah.
No, I haven't read it. I'm just listening to a critique of it though, as I was doing my shopping this morning. So,
well, maybe a topic for discussion another time then. But I found it fascinating so far. I think it's got a lot of different points about dominant narratives, especially as all of you were bringing up. And one of the points that really I think struck me was this notion of building capacity, which is very important if we want to get different perspectives. We need also to equip people to have that capacity to not only share their views, but also build and operate these systems. So, Kathleen, you mentioned, the work that you do in sort of low resource languages in natural language processing. So what have been some, challenges that you've overcome that showed you the power of community? And how we can achieve a more positive future with AI in it, and how education, especially given the work that you do there for women in the global South, how can that help us get to a better future?
Thank you for that question. So I'll say community shows me that there's true strength in diversity and inclusion. And it's so interesting to think that in some instances and platforms, this diversity is painted as a disadvantage. So I've mentioned that I'm part of Masakane, which is a network of researchers building African language tools. And I'll say that our biggest strength is that each of us speaks or understands at a minimum 2 African languages. And that's not only that, but we are part of the communities that use these languages every day. And I think that the bigger this network becomes, the stronger it becomes. I love that Masakane has its origins in community. And this means that we're intrinsically decentralized. And that is what I want for the future of AI, I'll say. For the people who are building solutions to be in contact with the people and to center localized contexts in the development of AI tools. And when it comes to women, allow me to give somewhat of a background before the response. So on the Common Voice project that I'm currently working on, the overall aim is to democratize voice recognition and essentially speech technology. What we learned from the status quo in speech technology and speech recognition at the moment is that systems have poorer performance for women than men. And this is likely as a result in imbalances in the data set. Now, since we are in the process of building a data set collection, we're being very intentional about ensuring that women get a chance to contribute their voices at a start. And this comes with having to acknowledge many other challenges women face. So they're less likely to have access to internet, less likely to have regular access to laptops, and less likely to have regular access to stable electricity to charge their phones even. And I think that the multi-layer complexities associated with being a woman in this particular instance, a woman in rural Africa, means that the barriers to your participation are so many. So I would like to see more women in leadership. I'll say we currently live in a world where men have been in positions of power, and the way AI has been designed thus far is no different. I'd like more women building systems for themselves, centering their experiences and challenges, and actually helping us have a far-reaching impact. One of my favorite meetups with organizing Nairobi Wimels was one where a woman came with her little girl because her help for the day didn't make it to work. And I love that it was a no-brainer for her to simply bring the child along. So I want more women curating these spaces, using AI in education and in healthcare and in business in ways that benefit their livelihoods, because then they can tell us the things that they actually really need.
That's fantastic, Kathleen. And I think, your point around bringing to the forefront diversity and those with lived experiences who can actually relate to and understand at a more fundamental level what some of these challenges are and what someone else might need to be able to effectively participate, I think is very important. In fact, it reminds me of this study or project that was carried out by an international aid agency in India, where they wanted to dig a well in a village in India so that women didn't have to walk very far away to fetch water. And they dug the well. It was successful, but when they came back a few months later, they saw that people weren't using that well. Why? Turns out that with the entire societal culture that existed within that part of India, women didn't have the freedom to talk about issues at home and other things, and their walk from their home to the nearby river bank to fetch water was the only time when they were independent, so as to say, so that they were free to talk about this. And that's why they didn't use the well. But this is something that, if you're not a part of that community, or if you don't have that lived experience, there are little chances that you would figure that out on your own. And so that's why I think I love the point that you bring up, that it's very important to do that. Switching gears a little bit here, I'd love to pose this question to you, Jason, given all the work that you do. What are some lessons that we can learn from Indigenous cultures that can help us shape a better relationship with technology, especially AI? Oh, Jason, you're on mute.
I'm muted. So I just want to preface by being really clear about the what I'm talking about as I'm talking about the specific work that I've been doing over the last decade or so with Indigenous communities in North America, the Pacific, Australia, and New Zealand. And there's a huge variety of indigenous approaches and thinkings about these things. So, I can pull some things from that came from the position paper that the Indigenous Protocol and AI group put together in our conversations there. One of those things is something that I'm really excited and happy to see Kathleen keep coming back to, is this idea of locality, right? Of really, how do we move from this model where we just sort of expect that technology is developed at the greatest scale that we can possibly obtain and at the highest level of abstraction and generalization, and how do we move, not entirely, there's still some things that's super valuable to think about in that way, but how do we move more development of things like AI that have very clear material consequences for the populations that use it? How do we move the development path more and more locally, so that local communities have the technique, they have the resources, they've built the capacity in their community to build these tools in the ways that they would like to do them. One of the things I like to think about, going back to what we call AI right now, is really just statistics, right? Is there's a lot of people who live in the long tail, right? Then they're real people and they're real communities. And just because our models require us to kind of make a cut at some point that excludes them, right, doesn't mean that we should be doing that, right? Because we see, what's already been mentioned, we see some of the consequences of that. Another thing is to take relationality to non-humans very seriously, right? So really thinking through what are our relationships, not just with other humans, but with the non-humans that exist all around us, whether they're other animals or they're plants or they're the river that sustains you, or whatever it might be, and to think through what that relationality means. And depending on your culture and your perspective, you're going to come to different answers. It's not that there's one way of thinking about relationality. And I think that's one thing that the position paper really shows, is that there's a common commitment to it, but there's really many different ways of going about expressing it. And then I think the third thing is tied to that, which is, is that ethical action is tied to protocol, right? So what are the processes which lead us into and help us be ethical? It's not something we're just born with, right? And it's not necessarily something I think that we can learn just by reading about. You have to enact them. And so for me, a lot of the protocols of my culture and the indigenous cultures that I've worked with, a lot of what's happening there is it's showing you how to act ethically, right? And it's giving you tools to remind yourself how to act ethically, to teach others how to act ethically, and to recognize sort of ethical and unethical ways of being. And so obviously we have lots of traditions that try to do this kind of work, right? So the question again is like, what locally do you have access to because you're part of, or you can learn from, or something like that, that helps make these ethical protocols visible and accessible and something that people take seriously.
Those are great points, Jason. I think, and it behooves us to not ignore all this work that's been done, all the history that exists there in terms of thought, the rich body of work, literature that adjacent and complementary fields have worked on. I think there's been this very sort of technocentric approach to building AI systems, which I think has, to its own detriment, ignored all the things that you mentioned, which exist as a rich body of literature. It's just I think people need to reach out and engage and welcome folks from other disciplines, other communities to come and build this together, if we might put it that way. Speaking of which, I really liked your comment about this long tail of very real people who sort of get excluded when we're building these kinds of systems. It reminds me of the work from one of the other scholars from Canada, Utah, Trevor Annis, who does a lot of fantastic work. And she has this thing that she calls the Lawnmower of Justice, where it's basically this idea that we trim off the tails of distribution so that we can just focus on the statistical norms because it's convenient. And that's unfortunate. So anyways, for those listening in, Yuta also does a lot of great work. So would encourage you to take a look at that. Talking about large scale problems, could there be anything larger than climate change? It's affecting all of us. It's something that is very immediate, it's very urgent. At times doesn't seem to be the case because it's happening at such a global level. Priya, you do a ton of work in that space and are one of the leading researchers when it comes to the intersection of climate change and AI. What would the best case outcome look like if AI is applied successfully to address this challenge?
Yeah, so maybe echoing some of the themes that came from both Jason and Kathleen, I think that the sort of best outcome for AI in addressing climate change is one where it is applied in a way that is, holistic, like really considering, why are we using this? What are the other issues that this intersects with? How can we actually incorporate this knowledge and understanding into this? And that is also very local. And in particular, as we think about, climate change is a global issue, that said, many of its effects will be felt locally and will be felt differently by different communities who are affected by climate change. So thinking about when we're adapting to the effects of climate change, so trying to build resilience to them, right? The ways in which we do that in different places are going to be different. In addition, when we try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in order to just reduce the extent to which climate change occurs, the sort of, availability of natural resources or, the amount of energy or emissions that people are already using or generating are very different in different places. So again, there has to be this sort of, view towards locality. And I think that one sort of challenge that exists, which I think should be shifted, is that when it comes to thinking about the way in which we scale AI for climate or climate tech or AI solutions in general, a lot of the funding structures, for example, that exist are predicated on how large can you scale this, right? So if you try to look for funding from a VC in Silicon Valley to develop something that is, a climate tech application, they will say, how big is the market? How large can this scale? There's sort of a baked into a lot of these structures is this notion of global scalability. And I think we really have to shift the ways in which we target our financing mechanisms, our capacity building and everything to really value those things that are providing, value at a local scale or on a smaller scale, but that are really providing true value that also addresses these edges of the distributions that we've been talking about. Because sort of without doing that, what we keep doing and keep perpetuating is this paradigm where a small set of people are purportedly developing solutions for everybody when really they are just for that small set of people or people who are represented in those demographics. So I think I really want to sort of encourage those who sort of do hold some of these funding structures and abilities to catalyze work to really think about how you actually build those structures in a way that breaks away from some of these assumptions of scale.
Absolutely, Priya. I think you're so right, and especially as we continue to push for these larger and larger scale models, especially now with GPT-3 and some of the other transformer-based models, you see that one, they're very, very expensive to train, of course. They also have huge environmental impacts, and this whole notion of scalability, I think you're so correct that it's so ingrained and enmeshed in how we think about this that we just can't imagine anything else, which I think is a sad state of affairs. Especially if we again, coming back to all of you have brought up this notion of locality again and again. I think if we develop solutions that work very well for our local communities, why not? Why not focus on that? Why not direct funding towards that? Why not direct capacity building towards that? Because I think that potentially does lead us to a more positive future. And when we're thinking about especially again, bringing it back to the notion of alternative AI futures, the current discourses are very sort of dystopia, centric. How much do you agree with those dystopia-centric discussions today? And to what extent do you think that they are malleable? Kathleen, would you like to start us off?
Sure. So to echo the sentiment shared by Jason at the outset of this conversation, I feel that we fixate on them a lot, and this fixation kind of makes it more likely that they come to be. But I don't buy it at all. I don't think AI necessarily has to take this one pathway that takes us to a dystopic future that's, everything we think it might become. And I think that the fact that we spend a disproportionate amount of time further building this narrative is somewhat irrational. Why can't we invest in better ones? And we should. And again, that's one of the reasons why I was pretty excited to be part of this panel. And I'm quite happy to just be nodding my head and agreeing with everything that Jason and Priya says. But I really don't agree with the, dystopia AI future. And I definitely think we all have, in our little capacities and little actions, the ability to build a very different reality.
Jason, Priya, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the ways I've talked about this before is I don't agree either. I think obviously that's not what we should be doing with our time. Is if we ever get to that point where there is some flowering of sentience or consciousness or agency or autonomy in these machines, my hope is that they don't kind of come to consciousness and look around and decide to, do the Skynet thing and try to get rid of us all, or the Matrix thing, use us as resources, or, the William Gibson thing, even, where they just look around and they're like, these people are messed up. I'm leaving. I'm going to Alpha Centauri, right? I hope they wake up and they look around and they're like, hey, these are some interesting relatives, right? And they've sort of been developing me in a way that I can look around now and be like, that was actually pretty healthy and interesting and caring, and I want to hang out and I want to work with them, right? So I think that, thinking through futures, for me, that's the kind of AI futures I want to think about, right? And it's just one way of not being dystopic or utopic about it either, right? Not painting some kind of, fairyland where, of course, everything is gonna work out just because we want it to. It's all going to be challenges, but the initial conditions that we are laying down for this technology are going to matter a lot in 50 years. We know this already because we're living through the initial conditions of the Industrial Revolution, right? 150 plus years later, right? We can, that's what historians are really great at. They're really great at tracing back and being like, oh, this crazy thing we do now that's really kind of destructive and not good, that all started with a series of decisions back then. Right? So we have to not give up on the fact that we do have the ability to influence our future. We're here now, we're working now, and we're setting the conditions for, the seventh generation. And how do we go about making it possible to, for more people to be part of the setting of those conditions?
Yeah, and I would say, I think clearly there are lots of different ways in which, AI is potentially a really great contributor to our future. So to get concrete on climate change, right, the only way we're going to be able to manage power grids with large amounts of renewable energy, which is really necessary to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, is using AI to dynamically optimize power grids alongside other tools, but AI will play a role there, or to forecast extreme events, or to accelerate the process of discovering next generation batteries, right? There are lots of concrete places and applications. But I guess on a slightly different note, I might, Abhishek, even disagree slightly with the premise of your question, which is, I think the premise was that the narrative or the discussion around AI today is largely dystopic. I would say that in certain places, sure. I think that if you look at, movies, popular media, et cetera, sure, there are a lot of dystopic depictions of AI. That said, I would also say the notion of dystopic AI is used to often dismiss concerns that are really necessary to bring up to get at this point that I think has been coming up, right? Figuring out how we can actually shape these futures going forward. I think sometimes when you have, people at the center of this movement, and I'll note particularly Black and Indigenous women at the center of this movement in the machine learning community, who are bringing up very important and valid concerns as to, the kinds of things we should be thinking about when thinking about how to shape AI going forward. I think there really is unfortunately, a predominant movement that says, you're raising ruckus for no reason, you're being dystopic, you're being anti-AI, when really the purpose of those movements is to help us build a more constructive future and make those choices going forward. So I think that in some sense, sure, again, I think in the popular media, et cetera, there is some dystopia, but I think a lot of the conversations that are here are fundamentally very constructive. And I think that viewing them as such will really allow us to, again, understand the agency we have in making these choices that shape a more positive future. Absolutely.
And I like that lens. I think that's very important that we do also highlight. And I think it's unfortunate, right? I think what sells in print and media are those very, antagonistic, adversarial, dystopic portrayals, because, well, I guess it makes for a good 90-minute flick in cinema, or, well, on Netflix now, I guess. Look at Squid Game, right? That's the kind of things that I guess people enjoy watching. So I'm really with you there. I think it's a great point that we need to support, highlight, emphasize these constructive discussions that are taking place. So maybe Priya, actually open back with you then. What do you think we can do to change that discourse concretely? What are some actions that people can take? How can communities engage more constructively so that we do have this and we don't continue to support these let's say negative narratives that are dominant?
Awesome. And I think there are a lot of things, and I clearly won't be able to cover all of them here, but to focus on one very specific recommendation is, I think, within our professional structures, building up ways to make sure that we're recognizing labor that's currently invisible. So I think a lot of the people, for example, who do a lot of organizing movements, including those that, for example, Jason and Kathleen are participants in that have been brought up here, right? They're often viewed as service. They're viewed as ancillary to research. When you're trying to get a job, they can be used to write you off as less legitimate. And I think that is starting to change a little bit in people's perceptions, but I don't think it's necessarily fundamentally changed in the underlying structures. Fundamentally, right, if you are going to be hiring based on citation counts, or you're going to be only viewing certain people's opinions as legit if they've published or done scholarship in a certain way, that doesn't work. So I think it's not just about individual people changing their notions towards these things, so that's a very important step, but it's about sort of building the underlying incentives and infrastructure to really value those additional contributions and view them as not just separate to scholarship, but really a very integral part of the scholarship that we do as in the AI community.
Absolutely. That's a great point. Jason, did you?
Yeah, I think just follow up, just last week, the Just Tech Fellowship call was released, and this is the Ford Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation down in the States. And I was part of an initial set of consultations about those fellowships. That part of it was really to think about AI and do scholarship around AI. And the question is how do we actually support people realistically who are doing this work, which is in some ways deeply involving community, right? Whether they're actually sitting in community, or they're sitting in a university, or they're sitting in a company and doing work with community, and how to do all those things Priya said about like how we have to expand that lens, right? Of like what we're gonna fund, right? What are we gonna fund, right? Well, some people are gonna have to fund childcare. Some people are gonna have to fund elder care. Some people are gonna have to fund meals. Some people, there's all sorts of funds, things that need support in order for people to do the work that have been excluded by the figure of the heroic white male who doesn't have any financial, familial, or community concerns, right? It's all been taken care of for him. So he can just focus, he can just be a brain, right? So, figuring out how to change those structures is a big part of the work.
So I'll say that taking more seriously the recommendation to bring other academic disciplines into, particularly the development of AI. And I say this because I currently live in a reality where now everyone wants to go into tech or is advised to go into tech because tech is big now. And when I was younger and in my formative years, like 13, 14, everybody wanted us to go into medicine because they said, hey, that's where all the opportunities are. The government is a great employer. There'll always be money. But the reality for doctors now is very different. So rather than telling everyone tech is where it's at, go into tech, I think we should value the fact that people bring expertise, right? I'm currently enjoying working with linguists because they have an inside knowledge of language that I don't have. And I don't like the fact that the way big tech, maybe I shouldn't say big tech, but the way AI is building NLP is that we're, throwing in more data and sort of ignoring the nuances of language and, structure and all of that. So I'd like to see more AI that is actually multidisciplinarily built. I'd like to see those communities brought into the room and actually given a voice and an opportunity to contribute. And I think that will see us potentially go away from AI as we know it now, or rather machine learning, into streams of work that are much more intentional and not just statistics.
That's very true. I think, I think there is just such a, and it was the same as it was for you, I guess, Kathleen, that, for me growing up in India, of course, there's always that pressure from your parents and your, other relatives that you got to go down a particular path because that's the path to, economic upliftment or getting a good job and, stability and all of those things. And I think the world is different today, right? I think we have a lot more opportunity, of course, with all the sort of negative aspects that still need to be addressed. There are alternative ways, and bringing in more, bringing in other disciplines more seriously, as you said, I think is only going to help support that direction even more. So that brings me to something else that's been on my mind, and I think that people listening in would love to learn about is students who are in their formative years now, who are in school, who are contemplating picking a field or perhaps already in the domain of AI. What do you what would be some concrete advice that you could offer them so that they can equip themselves better towards bringing AI into society, or thinking better about how technology generally should interact with other elements of society?
I guess very briefly, take the opportunities that you can to immerse yourself in multiple disciplines and ways of thinking. And in fact, the earlier in your life you can do this, the more this will not just form, in some sense, the facts that you know, but more so the way that you think about these issues in the first place. I think I was very lucky growing up to sort of be in an environment that both, emphasized STEM, science, technology, math, etc., and also liberal arts as sort of two very important ways of thinking, and tried to bring ways to merge those together. And I think that informs how I view the world. And I think a lot of other people who I admire and respect similarly had the opportunity to have that immersion very early on. So I'd say, to the extent that you can, engage in different disciplines, engage with people from different communities who may think differently than you do, and really try to build a mental model that is inclusive of all those different ways of thinking, so that you can build your future, endeavors on top of that.
And in fact, I'd love to point out some of the work that Priya's organization, Climate Change AI, they've released a call for people who either have a background in AI or in climate sciences. They're putting together a joint program for summer 22, which sort of embodies what Priya just said. So I'd encourage folks to check that out as well. Jason, you have thoughts on this?
I don't have anything to add what Priya just said. That's exactly what I would say. I think it's super important that people look at this, come at this from a multiple perspectives, and that they learn as much as they can from those multiple perspectives. So that was a great answer. Nothing more to add.
Kathleen?
I'll also echo Jason. I think Priya's answer was pretty succinct, especially identifying a community that can support you if you as you're exploring, always find a community that can support you beyond just the academics and actually engage to build something.
Yeah. I think that's it's very important, right? To the extent that we can enable that, as you were saying, in our own little actions, in our own little agency that we have in various roles that we hold, responsibilities that we hold. If we can encourage that, that's always a positive contribution, I would say. We do have a question from one of our viewers, one of the audience. And it's Moritz who asks, I would be interested in hearing what the panelists think about the very designation of ML technologies as intelligence, and what types of narratives, responses, histories, and practices this facilitates, but also perhaps obscures. And I think maybe Jason, if you want to open us with, because I think you've alluded to it already, would love to hear what you have to say, and then Kathleen and Priya. Please feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic case of, if you have a hammer, everything's a nail, right? So the most powerful, and really, it's about the most lucrative methods we have right now around, doing things that formerly humans were the best at doing, is the sort of suite of tools around machine learning. And so just the simple fact that has been so powerful and so lucrative has meant that, lots of other ways of thinking about intelligence. There's lots of work within the field that talks about, various kinds of intelligences and different ways of approaching intelligence. And, everything from, Rodney Brooks talking about embodied intelligence to, other people talking about diversity of intelligence, Marvin Minsky talking about the society of the mind. And, so the field sort of, let's say, kind of computer and sort of and neuroscience taken as a whole actually have lots of interesting things to say about what intelligence is. But because machine learning has sucked up so much of the oxygen and the funding in the room, those trajectories, have been kind of starved of a lot of energy for a while. Not completely. There's still people doing interesting work, but it's certainly an issue within the field, right? And so there's lots of different ways we can approach this thing called intelligence. But even then, one of the things I write about is that there is an issue of the Journal of Artificial General Intelligence that came out, I guess maybe 18 months ago, there's somebody who proposed a definition of intelligence in a journal article, and then there was a bunch of responses. And I got my hands on it. I was so excited because I was going to see, okay, finally, I'm going to see some discussion of the variety of things what we might want to talk about when we talk about intelligence and computational methods. It was so depressing. It was all the same thing with slight variations and arguing around like kind of slight definitions and stuff like that. But it was all about sort of rational, self-interested goal seeking. That was the definition, except for a couple of people like Roger Schenck, who had a fantastically cranky response. He's an early AI pioneer who went a different direction. Anyways, basically he says we need to stop calling this intelligence, right? It's super useful, really powerful, but it's not intelligence. And it's keeping us from being able to see what intelligence is.
Well, thank you, Jason. I really appreciate that. And I think it's important also, we're talking about alternative AI futures here. But what is alternative AI even, right? Or intelligence, forget the A, just the intelligence, right? I'd love if you have the link or reference for that handy so that we can drop it into the chat for everybody. Very cool. Priya, Kathleen, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess to mirror that, I'd say even though in some sense there's a broader discourse and notion around what intelligence means, that because of the way intelligence has been interpreted in the lens of AI, it's also very, anthropocentric. So in my own research, for example, the kinds of AI I work on are embedding knowledge of physics from electric power systems into the way that we construct machine learning models. And if you think about that, as a human, I can't optimize electric power grids. I don't have an internalized notion of what the, physics of electrons flowing along lines are. But this is still AI. This is still machine learning, and it's still something that, is in this umbrella. So I think that sometimes this sort of, mental model that some have around what intelligence means then precludes understanding of some of these other kind of ways of approaching these problems. And also to harken back to something Jason said earlier, because it means that it's very, human centric or anthropocentric, it means that we're often not considering, for example, interactions with nature, the environment, non-human entities. So I think that's something that the intelligence part obscures. Because the question also had a sort of a positive aspect to it, right? Which is, what does that notion of intelligence facilitate? I think I am very excited about, the efforts that have come about for people who are thinking about AGI to really try to understand, what is it that humans think about, and sort of interfaces with neuroscience, et cetera, that have come about as a result. But to echo again something that Jason said, I think I would love to see more fields that are not just, for example, neuroscience sort of brought into that broader conversation, so that we're kind of jointly building towards this broader notion of what intelligence is. Definitely.
And I know we're nearing the end of the time that we have, for this panel today. It's been fascinating so far. We've touched on so many different areas. Perhaps as a as a question towards wrapping up, is there a future where we don't use AI as extensively as we see currently? We see trends pointing towards, and what might that future look like? So Kathleen, maybe you want to kick us off?
I was recently reading an article about the Maori and how they're digitally preserving their language, but then are opting out of sharing it or having it used to build any sort of digital tools. And so I'm going to say, yes, I do see a future where AI tools are not used in much the same way that they can choose to not have their data be used to build AI tools. I think is much the same way an individual could be able to choose whether AI influences their life or not, or whether communities or societies or countries decide to be AI-free zones, in quotes. I don't think we are, bound to be in an AI future. It's a technology that we could use, but also we could not use, I'd say.
Yeah, I'd say, I think I see a future where AI is viewed as a tool, like many of the other tools we have across society, and that we don't take for granted that we use it in any particular case, and we don't take for granted that we don't use it in any particular case. And I think, to echo something Kathleen said, where there's, ideally, I think it should be built in a large amount of, consent, human dignity being centered in decisions around when and whether to use these tools. I think in a way, there are some places I would love to see AI used more. For example, again, in many climate relevant applications where there really is a big case to be made for using AI to optimize a system or forecast something, where that effort is not currently going. And there are many places I'd like to see AI used less, for example, certain aspects of social media. So I think it's less a question in some sense of the sum total of whether AI is not used or used, how much it is used. But I think it's a question of distribution, where, when, and why, and really sort of what values are centered in the way that we use it.
Jason?
So yeah, heartily agree. I think that there's lots of, it's sort of kind of naturalizing it in a way, but then being very careful about how we do that so that it doesn't become the answer to everything, I think is really important. I think it's also fun, to look at science fiction and, think about like, so Dune, the movie, movie just came out, but Dune, there's a future where they've actually gotten rid of all the thinking machines and developed and sort of like developed training mechanisms to train humans to do a lot of these computations, right? And there's things like Ian M. Banks' Culture series, which imagines a far future where there's sort of these benevolent AI minds, who are kind of there running everything, but kind of not necessarily involved in your day-to-day stuff. And I like The Expanse, the science fiction show. What's really interesting about The Expanse is it's definitely in the future, and it's also super localized, right? It's just our solar system, but there's no AI, right? And this is a show that was made in the last 5 years. It was a book that was written in the last, or a series in the last 10 years. And it's one of the things my friends and I talk about is it's so interesting to spend so much time in a space like that, where like what the computer is doing is like not a character in the show. It's really about humans trying to figure out how to be in space together, So I think that's one place when I try to think about what does it mean to have an AI-less future, is thinking about what that show is like.
Very cool. That's fantastic. And I think, for those who are listening and who have some time this weekend, of course, join in to the AI Festival and listen to all the amazing panels, but maybe watch a TV series, read another book, engage with your communities, because ultimately, I think it does come back to being creative with how we can imagine what an alternative AI future might look like, and working with other humans. Work with humans. We're great to co-develop, co-design, and imagine this future. I'll turn it over to Jeanette for some closing remarks. But before I do, huge thank you to Priya, Kathleen, Jason. It's been a delightful conversation. I've always wanted the opportunity to have sort of all of you together, kick around some ideas. I'm intimately familiar with each of your works, and so glad to have had this opportunity. Thank you to the Goethe-Institut and Jeanette for welcoming us, giving us the space. Over to you, Jeanette.